Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we are talking about a state that is very near and dear to my heart, home to friends and family alike, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia is one of the most history-rich states in the entire country. It was named after Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was called the Virgin Queen. It's also one of the original 13 colonies. It has one of the oldest settlements in the nation, Jamestown. It's the birthplace for 8 different U.S. presidents, and is the site for over half the battles fought in the American Civil War. Virginia also has a pretty diverse electorate, depending on which part of the state you're in. More recently, we've seen a lot of Democratic politics coming from Northern Virginia, while the rest of the state is more to the right. It's considered a valuable prize in presidential elections as well because of its swing state nature and its 13 electoral college votes. So let's go ahead and dive right in and talk about the U.S. House elections in Virginia. Virginia has 11 congressional districts in the U.S. House. The current balance of power is 7 Democrats to 4 Republicans. This is starkly different from the balance of power prior to the 2018 midterms, when it was the opposite. There were 7 Republicans to 4 Democrats. Out of the 11 districts in the state, districts 2, 7, and 10 are the ones that went from Republican to Democrat. What's also interesting to note is that all 3 of the candidates that flipped these seats were women. Indeed, the 2018 midterms saw a pretty significant turnout from Democrats and women alike. And sometimes those votes even overlapped a little. Really, the House elections in Virginia are just going to come down to these 3 districts. So let's go ahead and bring up our first line graph to see how Virginians have been voting over the last decade. So looking at this graph, we see that there are no real surprises in 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016. But when you look at that 2018 graph, what's extraordinary to me anyway is how the Democratic turnout virtually didn't fall off at all. Democratic numbers in a midterm election barely differed from the presidential election in 2016. Looking at this, it's no surprise then that Democrats were able to flip at least 1 seat, let alone 3. But keep in mind, these numbers are representative of the entire state of Virginia, so not all of those new Democratic votes in 2018 were within districts 2, 7, and 10. In order to understand more about how those voters influenced those swing districts, we have to look further. I like to use the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. And when we take a look at those numbers, we see that Virginia's 2nd district has a partisan lean of Republican +3 compared to the national average. District 10 has Democratic +1, and that 7th district has Republican +6. This means that of those 3 districts, the one that really could possibly flip this November is that 7th district. Democrat Abigail Spanberger defeated incumbent Republican Representative Dave Bratt in 2018, and Spanberger is running again this year. She ran a pretty moderate campaign in a pretty Republican district, which, as we know, secured the victory for her. Looking beyond her election victory in 2018, though, we see a more progressive voting record under her belt. She also won by slightly thinner margins than the other 2 women who flipped seats. Based on the nature of her district and her slight pivot to the left after winning in 2018, I don't think she's going to be able to hold on to this seat come November. Elaine Luria of Virginia's 2nd and Jennifer Wexton of Virginia's 10th were able to win by slightly larger margins. They have slightly less Republican districts, and I do think they will retain control of their seats. So in the end, we have a Republican net gain of 1 seat in the state of Virginia. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in the state of Virginia with incumbent Democratic Senator Mark Warner and an undecided Republican opponent. Mark Warner is running for his 3rd term this year and is enjoying, as of this video, a positive net approval of approximately +19. It's also important to note that the last time Warner had an election was 2014, and that year he won by less than 1%. 2014 was also an abysmal year for Democratic turnout. I don't imagine this year's election will be as close as the one in 2014, But let's take a look at some numbers and see what we can learn. So right now you're looking at some numbers for the senatorial to House vote ratio. What this means is how many votes a senatorial candidate from a given party will receive relative to the votes received for all House candidates of that same party. You'll notice right away that the Democratic ratio never falls below 100%, whereas the Republican ratio hovers around sort of the mid-90s, going all the way back to 2010. That value of nearly 127% in 2014 for Democrats is the only reason that Warner was able to squeak by with a victory. Had that number been 5% lower, he probably would have just narrowly lost to the challenger that year. Will Warner need a ratio that good to win again in 2020? Well, probably not, because this is what the US House election turnout has looked like over the past decade. We see a large gap opening up in 2018, and I have reason to believe that this gap will continue to be significant this year. This should be more than enough to carry Mark Warner to a third term this November. Hey Pollbot, let's crunch those numbers and find out the margin of victory. So yes, Mark Warner wins his seat handily this year by about 22%. The increased Democratic voter turnout coupled with his high approval numbers will make sure that that happens. So we have our first Democratic senatorial victory in this series. Let's put it on our next map. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and likely Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Looking at Virginia historically over the past decade, there are some important numbers that I want to bring to light here before we get into this current matchup. In 2012, Barack Obama won his re-election bid over Mitt Romney by approximately 4%. Fast forward to 2016 and we see Hillary Clinton winning Virginia over Donald Trump by just over 5%. So even going from a popular incumbent to a less popular candidate, we saw an increase in that margin of victory for Democrats. Democrats also narrowly outvoted Republicans in 2016 in raw House votes, something that they did not do in 2012. And bearing in mind that Democrats cleaned up in 2018, it's hard to imagine that they will not have a raw numbers advantage this November. But we also have to consider how the average Virginian votes for their president, so let's bring up some more numbers. These numbers are actually pretty similar to the ratios that we were seeing earlier for senatorial candidates to House candidates. Basically, the Democrats maintain a ratio of just over 100%, while the Republicans maintain a ratio of just under 100%. So in other words, if Democrats and Republicans turned out in the exact same numbers for House candidates, the Democratic presidential candidate would have an edge. My equation also considers the approval rating of the incumbent. And in the case of Virginia, Trump is down slightly at -5 approval. So considering the raw voter turnout, the presidential to House vote ratio, and Trump's -5 net approval, Pollbot, do me a favor, can you take all that and just, yeah, thanks. Okay, wow, yeah, Virginia is going pretty heavily to the Democrats this year. Trump losing a state like Virginia by over 17% is significant, but honestly, not that surprising. Democrats saw such a surge in voter turnout in 2018 that these numbers really do actually make a lot of sense to me, even considering the fact that the last two presidential elections were decided in Virginia by 4% or 5%. So now we have our first state won by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So today we've seen one House seat going back to the Republican column, we've seen a Democratic senator hold on to his seat, and we've seen Joe Biden win the state of Virginia. Now it's time to talk about where Virginia is going. Let's bring up an old line graph and two new ones and get into this. This is the US House turnout graph that I was showing you earlier. I've added trend lines to the graph to show the average rate of increase in voter turnout every election cycle. Because 2018 broke so heavily in the Democrats' favor, we see a much more extreme slope value for that blue trend line. Specifically, Democrats have added an average of 196,000 6,500 voters every 2 years, compared to Republicans' average increase of 41,200 voters every 2 years. These rates of increase, coupled with the Democrats' consistently higher senatorial and presidential voter ratios, spells bad news for the Republican Party. Speaking of ratios, these are estimated slopes for the rate of increase or decrease in those senatorial to House vote ratios and presidential to House vote ratios. Even though we're seeing higher raw turnout numbers from Democrats, we see that ratio for senatorial candidates declining at a very slow pace. This doesn't necessarily mean that the next senatorial election in the state of Virginia will break for the Republicans, but left unchecked, it could mean maybe in 2 or 3 senatorial election cycles that it could break for the Republicans. The presidential to House turnout ratios for both parties have slopes of nearly 0, and they're both in the negative. So looking at those numbers, I don't see any drastic change happening soon in how Virginians vote for their president. The main takeaway from today's video is that massive increase in Democratic turnout from 2016 to 2018 for House candidates. What that says to me is that Virginia is becoming more Democratic at a faster rate than maybe any other state in the country. Expect presidential candidates to spend less time in Virginia during election season for the next, at least the next decade. And that just about does it for our most recent episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I'm also on Twitter, and I will be posting on that account which state I am covering next ahead of the scheduled release dates. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter. The link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.